Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to give it a couple more seconds and I will launch if that's okay with all of you. And before I get started, everybody, I have audience Zoom etiquette that we would like you to follow. So just going forward, please use the chat only when instructed by the presenter. My particular slides do not have animations, but there are some animations, and so the presenter will control slides, polls, animations, etc. There are a lot of attendees in this room. It looks like we're going to hit the century mark and maybe go past it. We want to keep the chat enabled for discussion sections. Any inappropriate or offensive comments will result in immediate removal from the webinar room. And I'm hoping removal from the webinar itself. When we move to Q&A portion, which will be the predominant part of my presentation, please use the hand raise icon to indicate when you would like to be unmuted. Or if you are joining us by phone, welcome. If you're joining us by phone, please raise your hand and enter *9 to raise your hand. And our presenter, and well, not me. We have two administrators, Jesse Hernandez and Azabuke. What's your last name? Anyways.
Azabuke Akaba.
Akaba, sorry. They will be unmuting, they will be facilitating, and they will be pushing your questions through. I have a very conversational style of presenting, so I will be vibing off the facilitators. They will be asking their own questions as well as yours. And I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you, guys. I am going to get us started.
Good. Looks good.
Excellent. Thank you. So, San Francisco, 125 years of speculation. Going to run through this really quickly, and then we're going to talk about how this is still the same case today. So, in 1845, there was a mini revolution. It was nothing like the Alamo. And the state of California transferred over to the United States as opposed to being a province of Mexico. Starting in 1847, the first mayor of San Francisco, well, they were still called alcalde, but the first mayor of San Francisco began a policy of raising money via land grants and real estate speculation. Sounds familiar, right? So technically, the state of California owned all of the land in the state. However, the Mexican policy had already granted several pieces of property that needed to be grandfathered in San Francisco specifically. And this was a San Francisco exception until the turn of the 20th century. But in San Francisco, the state decided to allow the city of San Francisco to manage its land, and the state of California received 25% of any sales of land within within what was then designated as San Francisco. So San Francisco actually was the entire peninsula down to the San Francisco San Francisquito Creek, which is still there, which is actually the demarcation for San Mateo counties and Santa Clara counties, right at East Palo Alto. And by 1853, the city was selling water lots, that is water that is up to 4 miles into the bay, no land in sight, for $8,000 to $16,000 per lot, which I found fascinating. That translates to $2 to $4 million today. But there are parts of California right now where property lots are not selling for $16,000 per lot. So just imagine in the 1850s, we were already seeing that kind of speculation. Realistically, San Francisco was, and currently is, and always has been, a land speculation economy, as opposed to a tech economy. Or even back in those days, the people who actually got rich during the gold rush were not gold miners. They were people who were buying and selling land, and not always land they owned, and not always land it was legal to build on. So again, as is the case today, right? And then we're getting into redlining in the city and county of San Francisco. And I have to say, even before we get to here, back in 1851, San Francisco opened up its first public school, as public schools were coming online across the country, and it was a whites only school. By 1857, there was a blacks only school, which was in fact in my part of the city in Bayview Hunters Point. And by 1877, a Chinese public school was added because they didn't want non-white people to mix with white children, but they also did not want Chinese, and that's an umbrella term, it means all Asian people, to mix with Black and Native American people. So this was, I say, land segregation de facto and de jure. De jure actually means what is written on the paper. And so that is what is codified into law. When we are dealing with redlining, I mean, the country has always had a redlining policy. Mexico did not. So there is a lot to contend with when we became a state. However, in the early 20th century, realtors conducted a practice that was called steering, in which they would take undesirable ethnicities and steer them to specific places that they would prefer the undesirables live, using all kinds of hidden and twisted language and lies, etc. And that practice of steering was codified by the National Realtors Code of Ethics in 1924 in a clause that states a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy. So I guess I'm a character, not a human, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. And just to be clear, those realtors, those real estate agents who were willing to go against this code could actually lose their license, be kicked out, and or ostracized from the land management community. So this was a de facto, or as seen in reality or practice, not a de jure code, but effectively it was a form of economic terrorism against any liberal-minded real estate agents. These practices were technically supposed to be done away with the U.S. Housing Act of 1937, but this is when most people start associating the term redlining with land sales in the United States. So the US Housing Act was actually created to end discrimination in housing practices, except they had a handful of codices within the Housing Act, including this one. So it is not specific to race. It is specific to the land we are talking about. And it speaks directly to why so many of the red line neighborhoods are not just racially segregated, but why so much of heavy industry is found in those areas where racial segregation took place. It basically says you are not allowed to lend for investment in business or property if the condition, use, or design of the proposed security property or of those nearby properties that clearly affect the value of the proposed security property, provided that such determinants are strictly economic or physical in nature. So basically, this meant that you could not lend money, invest in businesses, real estate, or any public practices in places that had things going on the land already, which would make them unattractive to the quote common land purchaser. And that brings us to what's going on right now. And let me just give you guys a little bit of background on myself. My name is Michelle Pierce. Again, I am the executive director of the Bayview Hunters Point Community Advocates. We are an environmental justice organization based in Bayview Hunters Point, which most people know as the traditionally or legacy Black community in San Francisco. We weren't the only ones. We are barely the only ones now. And I am actually a second generation San Franciscan. My grandparents moved here from the South. My grandmother to work at the shipyard, and my grandfather was in the Navy. In the 1950s, my grandfather was very politically active. He walked the streets with future Mayor Joe Aliotto, and founded several guilds and labor unions, even the ones he was not in, to protect this community, along with several other residents out here in this community. They created the first cooperative grocer, which became the Alamany Farmers Market. It is the longest contiguously operating farmers market in the state of California. On top of several other things, my grandfather was one of 3 people to desegregate the electricians union. So I am a legacy child, and I bring all of that up to say that my mother, his daughter, created this slide in 1998. So this is a legacy that, if anything, has gotten worse rather than better. And we will see a graphical representation of what this particular slide speaks to. But just recognize that this slide is coming up on 20 years old now. And the same things that my grandfather was marching the streets for in the 50s is the same thing that his daughter 40 years later was marching the street for in the 40s. And we are in 2020, and I am still out here fighting these same issues. So Bayview Hunters Point is located in the southeast corner of San Francisco. It's that little red dot down at the bottom. It is home to it was home to about 35,000 residents in 1998. We're in 2020. The estimates for how many people live here range from 50,000 to 80,000 residents now. And that is probably a gross underestimate, since the predominant housing developments in the city are actually concentrated along the eastern corridor of the city. So fingers crossed, 50 to 80,000 is about what it is. Greater than 50% of the land used in Bayview Hunters Point is actually dedicated to industrial use. And we have heavy and light industrial uses. So most people do not associate San Francisco with manufacturing and refineries. And we have it. It's all buried in the Black and brown neighborhoods. 1/3 of the city's hazardous waste sites are in Bayview Hunters Point. This is 1994. There was one federal Superfund site then, 100 brownfield sites, and one of 3 sewage treatment plants in Bayview Hunters Point. All of that wonderful stuff is here. 80% of the city's wastewater was treated in Bayview Hunters Point at this time. It is 87% on average actually treated at this time. And here is the community's development of what was going on in the neighborhood. This is a community ground truthing map that was put together in 1996. A group of social and environmental justice organizations came together to form the Southeast Alliance for Environmental Justice, or SAGE. They hired on attorneys and law students from UC Hastings and from Golden Gate University to help them put together an argument to stop a 4th electrical generation plant from being placed in our neighborhood when you have an entire city that could host it. And in developing their argument for why we should not host such a facility in our neighborhood, we coined a phrase, cumulative impacts, because we as a community came together and walked the streets and chronicled all of the heavy polluting businesses within our neighborhood and mapped out how that contributes to our overall health and our quality of life just living here. And this map is the result of that ground truthing led by our community. So in 2021, we still are the only neighborhood in San Francisco that is zoned for industrial and agricultural use, but the zoning is not in dedicated blocks. We are in fact zoned for industrial, agricultural, and residential uses. And my house is in fact located at, let's see if I can, my house is right here. My house is literally right here in the middle of all of these lovely spots. They include hazardous waste emitters. They include buried and abandoned storage tanks for fuels and chemicals. They include high output manufacturing plants. We have a rendering plant and 2 chicken abattoirs. Just some lovely, lovely stuff. Add to that a study that community requested Federal Environmental Protection Agency Region 9 do for us, that produced a report showing that over 300 proposed development projects cited in Bayview Hunters Point are in fact on brownfield sites. And then you have the lovely shipyard, which is this bright red patch that nothing is happening on, only something is happening on it. It is comprised of 750 acres of what is considered prime real estate development land. And there are already 2 phases of housing existing there. However, the Hunters Point Shipyard had a different name. It was called the Radiological Laboratory. It was the National Radiological Laboratory. It was the on-the-ground facility for experiments for the Manhattan Project. So all of that happened there, including testing on humans and animals, and none of that waste was properly cleaned up. And that 750 acres of prime real estate is currently hosting condominiums that go for $1.2 to $2 million in my lovely neighborhood. And this is not the end. What are we doing to address this stuff? So we strongly believe in the environmental justice policy practices that state that if any policy is going to affect a disadvantaged community, then that community needs to be in the lead or co-lead of the development of that policy. And we have started becoming extremely sophisticated across the entire Bay Area around environmental justice issues. What we are doing right now is educating people on the streets in our Southeast Council on exactly how policy is formed. We want to see all the nasty parts of how the sausage is made. We go through extensive trainings in municipal planning, in policy development, in mapping and tracking, in toxics identification, in economic policy. We are working through exactly how budgets for cities and states work with the Budget Justice Committee. And we, Bayview Hunters Point, in partnership with several organizations and city agencies, including University of California at San Francisco, Stanford University, the Office of Workforce and Economic Development, we are creating actual community impact reporting processes for us and all of our fellow nonprofits in Bayview Hunters Point in order for us to see how city and state dollars are getting spent in our neighborhood, if in fact it is benefiting us and our neighbors, and how long those dollars that get invested into our neighborhood recycle through our neighborhood to see what's going on. So that's what we're doing right now. Thank you guys for sticking with me through this presentation. And I would like to open it up to questions because I prefer the conversation and the questions and answers. Thank you guys.
Hey, thank you, Michelle. That was an excellent presentation, and you gave us a really good background, a historical background from your family. So we're opening up for questions. My name is Ozzie Akaba. I'm with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And so I'm co-facilitating this discussion today. Are there any questions so far? Hands raised? Nope.
Yeah, we have one hand from Miss Margaret Gordon.
Good morning, everyone.
Good
Morning, Miss Margaret. Aren't you supposed to be in your own room?
Yeah, I know, but I had a conflict.
Oh, okay.
So I'm sorry I didn't get to present based in West Oakland. But as a resident, as a former resident, raised in San Francisco, I would like to add on the outer side of San Francisco, where the BART station is and where Highway 280 is, that was a Black community in the late 40s all the way into the mid 60s. But what destroyed that community is that the state of California decided to put Highway 280 in and also the BART system. and that my family and other community members at the time fought the Department of Transportation and the highway and Caltrans to get market rate for our housing, and fought the issue of eminent domain. So people be thinking that Oakland, the Bay Area, has been so progressive over the years, but they have participated. These different agencies have participated in destroying the Black community over the years. First starting with happened within Fillmore over the years, then onto the outer side through the freeways that they brought in, and transportation issues, and then further on into Bayview Hunters Point. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Margaret is one of my biggest mentors. And when I was talking about the people who brought me through to where I am, she is definitely one of them, one of the founders of environmental justice in the Bay Area. So absolutely. And she is correct. What we consider Excelsior, Portola, Visitation Valley, all of that was a Black and Chinese neighborhood up until the 60s.
Okay, I want to get good morning, Ladonna Williams next.
Another one of my mentors, ladies and gentlemen.
Go ahead, Ladonna.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Michelle. Good morning, Ozzie. Great presentation. Being born and raised in San Francisco, this is near and dear to my heart. I do have family members that have lived in Hunters Point their whole lives. Some of them aren't still here today, but Visitation Valley, Betrayal Hill, this is near and dear to me. But I did want to ask, I noticed you went through the history and you mentioned the Latinos, but I didn't hear a mention. And so I did want to get your opinion on the fact that from my research, Black folks couldn't even own property in San Francisco until the mid-40s. They were prevented from owning property, whereas Latinos could claim white, and so could Asians in some instances. So they were documented as owning or having the ability to purchase property, whereas Black people were prevented. They were excluded from that, particularly in the Bay Area, in the area where you guys currently live. So I wanted to get your take on that. And I'm coming from that standpoint. I really liked Kevin and how he opened this up, saying this was going to be difficult conversations, but y'all know me, I'm going to come in and push and make it difficult anyway, right? But I love the fact that Kevin opened it up that way. But he said, what does this history mean to you? So he personally individualize that. We think about it individually and collectively when we're taking on this subject, prejudice and pollution, which is a very serious subject. But also knowing that in these battles that we've had, I appreciate what Margaret was mentioning, that history. But whenever we talk about Black or we ask for specific issues related to Black or African Americans, we always have to include others. We're not saying that they don't suffer injustices, but they don't suffer them at the rate that we do. And even the opening remarks with Kevin them on that snapshot that he showed of the various statements made about racism and prejudice, which in my opinion should have been racism included in there with pollution and discrimination as well. But there was no mention of Black in there. They mentioned Japanese and they mentioned Mexicans. There was no mention of Black folks. So I wanted to get your take on, and I'm talking specific to Black, not Black and brown, not Black and everything else, specific to Black. What has been your research or knowledge about the exclusion of Black folks owning property? Thank you. In Hunters Point.
No, yes, yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ladonna. And as far as I know, you are correct. The first Black family to purchase property out here in San Francisco was in Hunters Point in, I believe, 1941. And they actually had to go through an agent who was willing to sell to them, but the agent went and found a white person, and I believe it was an Italian, to actually buy the property, but they listed it as Black people owning it. That was one of my organization's founders, Oscar James's grandparents, who bought that property. And to the opening ceremonies conversation, and also your point, Ladonna, outside of Bayview Hunters Point, the reason that Black people were able to buy into the Fillmore is because all of the Fillmore actually was Japantown. And when they interred the Japanese in during the war, all of the Japanese property owners lost all rights and titles to their land, but those properties were not considered clean. So the only people who were allowed to buy those properties were Black people. And so the late 40s, early 50s is when Black people started heavily investing in the Fillmore as well, as a result of double discrimination. How does it affect me? So starting with the fact that I opened up with the 1850s being when the Black school was opened, and not truly desegregating our schools even to this day in terms of Black people. It seems like every other ethnicity has opportunities to move out, and our only opportunities to move out are actually to the outer reaches of the Bay Area, not within the city itself. All of those practices are still common. The inability to get a mortgage, the difficulty of renting spaces that are not specifically for impoverished people of color. When I was pointing out a housing policy and how skewed it was to our planning department, I stated the fact that I have multiple degrees, was working in a white collar technical professional position for the Department of the Environment, and the restrictions they were putting on housing purchases here in Bayview Hunters Point meant that I would not qualify either on the low or the upper income scale. And they told me, oh, well, you might want to look into, and they suggested the public housing facilities, the projects. And I was like, excuse me, given my background, if I was white or Asian, would you have suggested the projects? Oh, no, that's not what we meant. No, that's what you said. And all of us in the room heard it. So to this day, that is a truism, right? And it is so real. And it is one of those things that all of us have to navigate. And it is one of those things that I particularly found funny, since I have 2 MBAs. So now I understand money and economics and loans and investments. And I probably understood it better than the lady in planning, but that's the best she could give to me because she assumed I could never get there. So thank you very much, Ladonna. Yes, Oz.
Yeah, I want to get to some more questions. We only have a few minutes left. So Noah Arroyo, and then we'll go with Lonnie. Okay, Noah.
Hi there. Actually, considering that we have so little time, I want to put forward that I could step aside and just let Lonnie get to his question. I'm glad to do that.
Okay, Lonnie.
No, you could have went, but there was no problem. Let me give you a little bit of my background. My name is Lonnie Mason. I'm the executive director of First Generation Environmental Health and Economic Development. Appreciate the presentation, Michelle, the history. But I wanted to talk a little bit of something about what's going on now. And something that's, being looked over, but it's something that needs to be addressed. It has to be addressed. But I'm gonna say this: my grandparents moved here in the 40s. Actually, both of my grandparents, my grandfather worked on the shipyard, and my father was, and his sisters and siblings were born on Navy Road, right there above where we have the toxic waste and various things. But let me just get to this point. We have an issue. We have a concrete plant. That's been in operation for over 20 years without a permit, as well as recology for 5 years. And it's interesting, there between Pier 92 and 96. And if we looked at the map there, we'll see that the redlining on that is very serious. It's toxicity over there is deep. But they have a homeless shelter in there, in that facility. And I don't understand why individuals overlook this situation and say we have no other course or no other recourse but to put them in that area. Doesn't make sense. None of those individuals understand the health risk that they're at right now, at this time. They don't even understand what's going on. And the people that are there who are operating the situation, they think it's nothing, but it's a very serious situation. And so everyone here needs to know that we have prejudice and still systemic racism still going on right now, because the majority of the people in that homeless shelter,
I was just about to say that too.
is Black.
Yeah.
They're Black people. It's uncalled for. They could make a way to find another avenue to put those individuals somewhere else. We shouldn't look at them because of their lifestyle and what they've been involved in, whether it's drugs or anything else, or a mental issue, and they don't know and they don't understand, and take advantage of them. Okay, let's just throw them here. Because what if they do decide to get their life together and right, and then eventually when they do that and they get out of that scenario, now they have some other type of disease that was formed from breathing in all that toxic waste. They won't last. And it's not right and it's not fair. Sorry, I'm sorry, taking up too much time, but that's the main concern and issue for me. I was born and raised in Hunters Point myself, and we got to just look at the people who was a part of that situation and who okayed it. We definitely got to.
Thank you, Lonnie. Thank you very much. I know you got history in that area, and I appreciate that contribution, especially making it pertinent to what's happening right now today. So Michelle, we're already at time, but I would like for you to
I do want to address that because I was one of the people who got that. And by the way, again, everybody in the audience, Lonnie and I go way back. He is, in fact, one of the founding members of our community council that I just described. We, in the middle of the pandemic, were looking for someplace to place people. And that was the only place that we were allowed to put that homeless shelter. It's actually a vehicle triage center, not a shelter. It is comprised of 110 extended RVs, and the average time that people stay there before being placed into an apartment is about 7 months. So people are cycling out of it and into permanent housing, but it is meant to be temporary. It is there specifically for the pandemic. It is The environment is probably even worse than Lonnie is describing. I fully acknowledge that. We worked really hard, and it took an extra year for us to get industrial air scrubbers for each of those trailers, trying to protect people when they're inside, but there is no protection for them when they're outside, and we have to acknowledge that. I have done some workshops with them around toxic exposures and how to protect themselves, but this is the only thing that the city offered up. And Lonnie is absolutely correct in that the homeless population in Bayview Hunters Point gets ignored, it gets discounted, it gets shunted to the side, and then it gets shunted into extremely toxic sites. And by the way, this site is just throwing distance across the water from that shipyard that we keep alluding to, that it is a federal Superfund site. So yes, this is demonstrably how extremely impoverished Black people get treated in this city. So thank you very much for that, Lonnie. And
All
thank
right.
you, Oz. Too late? Can we go back to Noah? No?
No, we already
Okay.
we got 1 minute left. I apologize for not time constraints. And I want to thank everybody for attending and give some feedback about Michelle's presentation. We want to hear more about it, and she'll be able to share the slides that she has at the end. We'll make that available. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Jesse. Hey, Scott.